The Lesson by Roger McGough. Chaos ruled okay in the classroom as bravely the teacher walked in. The Nulligans ignored him. His voice was lost in the din. The theme for today is violence, and homework will be set. I'm going to teach you a lesson, one that you'll never forget. He picked on a boy who was shouting and throttled him then and there, then garroted the girl behind him, the one with grotty hair. Then sword in hand he hacked his way between the chattering rows. First come, first severed, he declared. Fingers, feet, or toes. He threw the sword at a latecomer and struck with deadly aim. Then pulling out a shotgun, he continued with his game. The first blast cleared the back row, where those who skive hang out. They collapsed like rubber dinghies when the plugs pulled out. Please, may I leave the room, sir? A trembling vandal inquired. Of course you may, said teacher. Put the gun to his temple and fired. The head popped a head round the doorway to see why a din was being made. Nodded understandingly, then tossed in a grenade. And when the ammo was well spent, with blood on every chair, silence shuffled forward, with its hands up in the air. The teacher surveyed the carnage, the dying and the dead. He waggled a finger severely. Now let that be a lesson, he said. Looking at the first two verses, there is no standard punctuation at all. In fact, in the entire poem, there's no standard punctuation like periods, commas, or dashes. The only punctuation used is quotation marks to indicate speech, question marks to indicate the tone of speech, and parentheses. This is to make the poem sound more rushed and chaotic, since the procession of events seem to be spoken in only one breath. McGough never refers to the students in the poem as students, but rather as vandals, nulligans, latecomers, skies, etc., which all have a bad denotation and can be associated with criminals or delinquents. In fact, we only infer that they are students. For all we know, the people he mentions could be particularly annoying colleagues at a meeting in a classroom. This lack of specification leaves more room for symbolism and interpretation, since the group isn't concrete or defined. The poem contains a double entendre in the title, The Lesson. The teacher is trying to present a literal lesson, lecture, chapter, whatever you want to call it, but at the same time, he is also teaching the students, quote-unquote, a lesson, one that you will never forget, referring to the idiom. He's teaching a lesson about violence by using violence, which seems like a bit of a contradiction. The imagery of this poem is grotesque and extremely easy to visualize. The teacher throttles a shouting boy, garrots a girl, shoots a trembling vandal, and at the end of the detailed massacre, there's blood on every chair. This evokes strong emotion from us as the readers, making us feel shocked and appalled at the teacher, as well as disgusted at the deeper meaning or the symbols in the poem. Even with death occurring at every turn, the tone of the poem is quite lighthearted and matter-of-fact, with a twist of dark humor which makes it seem psychotic. This is shown when the teacher humorously puns, declaring, first come, first severed, fingers, feet, or toes. You can practically hear the chuckle under the teacher's breath as the line is said, although the straight meaning of the declaration is violent. The whole process is described as his game, and the teacher speaks and acts normally when not killing his students, such as when he permits a student to leave the room like any typical teacher would, then promptly shoots him, or when the teacher waggled a finger severely towards a group of dead and dying students, as though he had simply given out a few scoldings and slaps on the wrist for bad behavior. The denotation of words used to describe the students can be associated with delinquency or criminals, so it's possible that this classroom can represent the current judicial institution and the death penalty. The teacher is a symbol for judicial institutions, while the head, who merely adds ammunition to the massacre after checking in on the situation, a common fate for cases appealed to higher appellate courts, represents higher level courts like the Supreme Court, which at the time hadn't outlawed death penalty in the UK and has currently allowed capital punishment in the US. Criminals are symbolized by the students, which may also mean that criminals need to be educated about the wrongs of their actions. This poem is a satirical attack on judicial institutions and the justice system. Also, the silence at the end may symbolize peace, with its hands up in the air. which the teacher inevitably breaks by speaking his final line. Since the imagery is so up close and personal, it may indicate that every judge in justice is involved in the death penalty and carry just as much guilt as the executioner. Starting off, there's a little bit of irony in the poem involving the double entendre in the title. The teacher is trying to teach a lesson, but by killing the student, his lesson is not retained at all, and is therefore forgotten. Since the teacher represents judicial institutions and the students represent criminals, this poem takes a liberal viewpoint against capital punishment, telling that capital punishment is not an effective way to combat criminals. Just like fighting fire with water is much more effective than fighting fire with fire. Therefore, the theme is, people can't learn from their mistakes if the punishment is synonymous with the crime. Queue by Roger McGough. I join the queue. We move up nicely. I ask the lady in front, what are we queuing for? To join another queue, she explains. How pointless, I say. I'm leaving, she points to another long queue. Then you must get in line. I join the queue. We move up nicely. This poem has an incredibly calm, laid-back tone, suggesting normalcy and that this happens on an everyday basis, switching endlessly from one queue to another. Also, it's mentioned that the author asked the lady in front, what are we queuing for? He doesn't even know the purpose of his own actions, but go on following the directions of society. There's one italicized word in the poem found on the 7th line, pointless. When read aloud, italics often convey a whisper, sigh, wondering thought, etc., and this time is no different. In this case, italics make the word seem like it has been repeated multiple times, as if sighed and wrote. To demonstrate, how pointless, I say. The repetition of the first verse as the last verse further accentuates this feeling of routine recurrence, going round and round and round, repeating over and over. I join the queue, we move up nicely. I join the queue, we move up nicely. Other than the italics, the rest of the punctuation in the poem is absolutely normal, with a basic sentence structure of periods and capitalization, emphasizing the very normalcy that the poem conveys. The first and last verses are only 2 lines long as opposed to the 4 lines of the second and third verses. Since the first and last verses sum up and combine to equal the length of the other 2 verses, this may indicate that they should be connected and create a cycle. This is further accentuated by noting that the first and last verses are repeated. The second and third verses also have the same number of syllables, 22, giving a strict sense of order in the poem, although the poem is in free verse and lacks concrete rhythm or rhyme at first read, or among each individual line. One peculiar aspect of this poem is its title. Why did McGough use the letter Q rather than the full word Q? Maybe it's in the appearance of the letter itself. If you look closely at the typed, print capital letter Q, you see that it's a circle, an O, in all aspects except for a line leading out of it in the lower right-hand corner. This may indicate that life can be endless looping, moving around and around the O, but there is a tiny path out of the crippling normalcy. In the last line of the third verse, the lady says, "Then you must get in line." This sentence holds a slightly commanding tone since the word must is used, making it seem imperative that the narrator join another queue. Also, the word line is used here instead of the often repeated word queue, even though a suitable replacement such as "then you must join the queue" would have the same meaning and number of syllables. This makes it seem as if this particular sentence is unique. The line could be society's rules ordering people to follow routine and move in an endless circle of queues. The narrator claims that the people in the queue move up nicely. Move nicely to where? It's an infinite process, moving up nicely to join another queue, where they move up nicely again. Since nicely is a relative term, not a concrete one, are they even moving up at all, or simply being given the illusion of moving? Queues are usually found in crowded places like the city. City life is typically associated with routine 9-to-5 jobs, punching time cards, etc. Therefore, the cues can symbolize the average person's life rotating around and around, never breaking free from the routine and endless cues. He doesn't know the reason for his actions, but nevertheless continues to do as he is instructed, such as joining another cue to try to leave the cues, even though he thinks that he is leaving the system when he says, "I'm leaving," in line 8. Also, the lady can symbolize society's rules, ordering everyone to follow a set routine. From all this, we can conclude that the theme is, it is difficult to escape the system of society. Even though the narrator realizes that his situation is pointless and tries to leave, he is only redirected to another cue or part in an endless cycle. The rote normalcy of the poem suggests that the same thing happens on a regular basis, never stopping, and accepted and ingrained by society.